Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode in the Cross Questioned. And we have been looking so far in this series at how the Bible, specifically the New Testament, speaks about the Easter story. And up to this point, we have got Jesus being arrested, he's been captured, and he's been taken before Herod and Pilate. And Herod and Pilate are sitting in between each other because neither of them wants to take responsibility for sentencing him, that neither of them can find any guilt in him. This is what we found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now we're getting to the point where John starts to fill in the blanks left behind by the other three gospel writers. Remember, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they're writing their books, they are writing them long before John came along. John writes his book at a much later stage. John has been influenced by the teachings and the writings and the churches that were around that were set up by Paul. Paul is one of the converts who converted to Christianity, and he is now taken control of Christianity in the modern world. Then the book of John was written. So the book of John is Johnny come lately, really, because it's the last book to be added in. Even the writings of Paul predate John. So not all the books of Paul, some of them were written a bit later or date a bit later. But John's gospel is the latest one. So what John does is he's got history on his side. So he can see the mistakes that Matthew made, Mark made, Luke made, and the comments that the people were making at the time when they read Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account. So John tries to correct any mistakes he makes. So he has used a lot of editorial rights in his writings. And so we'll find he writes himself into scenes. So he writes himself into the gospel in a way that will present himself in the best light possible. And how do we know this? Because he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. And other verses as well, he calls himself the other disciple, who manages to get the other disciples into places which they would not be able to get into. So John fills in all the gaps left by the other three gospel writers. He makes Jesus now talk to Pilate when he is being interrogated. Remember that John's Jesus is very different to Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Jesus, or the Jesus that you and I may have become accustomed to through the media or through theater or through movies or through anything else like that. So his Jesus is very powerful, very strong, not afraid of anything. This is the Jesus that has been portrayed in the Gospel of John. So he has Jesus being almost assertive and strong and powerful, somewhat insolent when he's talking to Pilate. And the narration goes something like this in the Bible. Pilate went back into his headquarters and summoned Jesus and says to Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. Some versions quote, "Are you the king of the Jews? I take it." Or some versions will say, "You are the king of the Jews, I take it." Whichever version you would like to take. But generally the question is, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says to him, "Is it your idea, or has someone suggested that to you?" The way that Jesus is portrayed here is very assertive and aggressive. Imagine if you or I, not that we are anything like a prophet, if you were brought before the judge for whatever charge it was, maybe you knocked somebody over with your car, and you were standing before the judge, and the judge would say, "What is your name?" You would be very afraid. We're very nervous when we speak. But not in John's gospel. John's gospel, he's got Jesus being very firm and very self-assured, not afraid of anything, like, I can take on anything. And so the narration continues like this in the Bible, where Pilate actually says to Jesus, when Jesus makes this statement, when Jesus says to him, "Is it your idea, or has somebody suggested to you?" Pilate says to him, "What? Am I a Jew?" In other words, how must I know? I'm not a Jew. Then the narration continues and says, "Your own nation and your chief priests have brought you before me. What have you done?" This is what Pilate continues to say to Jesus. So Jesus replies to him and says, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If I did, my followers would fight to save me from being arrested by those Jews, or by the Jews, as most accounts have it. My kingdom authority comes from elsewhere. You're a king then, says Pilate. And Jesus says, king is your word. So you see Jesus as being very self-assured. Pilate says, so you're a king then? And Jesus says, well, it's your words. You say the word king. My task is to bear witness to the truth, says Jesus. For this I was born, for this I came into the world, and all of you are deaf and dumb who do not listen to my voice. I mean, this is very different to what we expect of the meek and mild, and I don't say anything Jesus said we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then Pilate says to him, what is truth? Now they're having a philosophical discussion. So Pilate says, what is truth? And with these words went out again and went to speak to the Jews. Then Pilate says to the Jews, for my part, he said, I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release a prisoner for you at Passover time. Would you like me to release the king of the Jews, or would you like me to release Barabbas, who was a bandit? And the crowd arose and said, not him, we want Barabbas released. Don't release Jesus, release Barabbas, the crook or the bandit. And this is found in John chapter 18, verse 33 onwards. So in this story, we see that a number of issues come up. Who is this Barabbas? John suddenly brings up this person's name. Who is this man, Barabbas, that has just been thrown into this whole scene? Why would people want him to be released while Pilate had asked for some information about Jesus? Both men had discussed between each other that they could find no problems with him. Here with John's story, we find that people are given an option. They're given an option. Either they can release Barabbas or they can release Jesus. Remember when Jesus was arrested, Jesus says, what am I? Am I a bandit that you come with your clubs and your swords and your armed guards? You could have arrested me at any other time. This is why it was mentioned at that time. This is why the dialogue was written, that Jesus was to say, what, am I a bandit? Because now the question is put to the people, would you like me to release Jesus, or would you like me to release the bandit? You see how the writer is trying to create a thought for the future. Now, it also says in this passage that we looked at, it was at the festive season, the governor asked to release one prisoner at the people's request. As it happened, the man known as Barabbas was then in custody for a rebellion who had committed murder in an uprising. So this is the version that we find in Mark chapter 15, verse 6 to 8. Now Matthew calls him a man of some notoriety. Barabbas, the man's name is. So Matthew calls him a man of some notoriety in Matthew 27, verse 16. Luke calls him the man had been put into prison for an uprising that had taken place in the city for murder. So Matthew calls him a very well-known criminal. Luke says he was put into prison for murdering, uprising against the Romans. Luke chapter 23, verse 19. And the story that sort of goes, that continues from where we left off, goes in, when the crowd came and asked for the usual favor, who would you like to have released, the king of the Jews? For they can find nothing wrong with him. They all chose to have Barabbas released. They said, release Barabbas and crucify the king of the Jews. They shouted, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. So Pilate asked them, why? And they shouted even louder, crucify him. And this is paraphrased from Mark chapter 15 from verse 14 onwards, which you can read yourself. Luke says that for the third time he spoke to them and asked, what has he done? And I can find no fault, I cannot find anything deserving and a capital offense, and therefore all I can do is simply flog him. But they insisted and they demanded, shouting that Jesus should be crucified. And Pilate asked the crowd, then what am I to do with this man? And they all shouted again, like the other version said, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. This can be found in Matthew chapter 27, verse 22 onwards. Now, according to John, the whole affair could not be so short and so simple, so he has his own version that he brings up. And this can be found in John chapter 19, verse 4 and 5. And it goes like this. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Here he is. I am bringing him out to let you know that I can find no case or nothing wrong with him. I cannot find this man guilty." But before this happened, Pilate took him and had him flogged or beaten, had him whipped. And the soldiers, in the narration it says, the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and placed on his head, and they put a robe on him. It was a purple cloak that they put around him. And then time after time they came out to him crying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him in the face. This is what we find in John chapter 19, verse 1 to 3. Now it is strange that on one hand, Pilate concluded that Jesus was innocent, and yet he had him flogged anyway. If you find somebody not guilty, it's never the case if somebody is not guilty that you still pass a sentence against them and sentence them to some type of punishment. If somebody is not guilty, they're normally not guilty. Well, it's time for us to take a break, and when we get back from the break, we'll continue, inshallah.
He faces.
My question is I have two questions.
He listens.
My question is about the beard, about Imam Mahdi.
What other people believe in.
He answers.
So number one is the help of Allah.
He satisfies in the light of glorious Quran and authentic Hadith.
If Allah helps you, believe me, you have to get success.
Catch Dr. Zakir.
Then we have the next call, please.
To get convincing and valid answers in Dial Dr. Zakir every Thursday at 6:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 9:30 a.m. Saudi Arabia on Peace TV.
Most countries of the world ban bullying. They fight it in their schools and universities. A lot of us are being bullied differently every single day. Some come up to us and say, "Do this," while others say, "Don't you dare." Some say this is halal, while others say, "Nope, this is haram." Are you confused? Do you feel lost? Join me in Umdat al-Ahkam, where with the grace of Allah, we will learn the proper knowledge from the Quran and from the Sunnah, which would help stop this kind of bullying.
Join Asim Al-Hakim in Umdatul Ahkam next on Peace TV.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back from the break. So we are talking about the incident that we found in John chapter 19, verse 1 to 3, where Jesus is now, according to John, being beaten, he's been flogged. People struck him, they're mocking him, they call him the King of the Jews, and they put a purple robe around him. Now it's very strange that on the one hand, Pilate makes the decision that Jesus is innocent, yet he still has him flogged. It seems that he may have thought that being a non-Jew himself, that if he was to just simply flog Jesus, then the crime would be forgiven by the people and there would be no reason to go any further. And if he had just flogged him, the crowd would be satisfied and they'd all go home and prepare for this very, very important religious festival that they will all come there for. But it is interesting to look at what the text actually says. And Jesus came out wearing a crown of thorns and a purple cloak. "Behold the man," said Pilate to the people. The chief priests and their henchmen saw him and shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him. Take him and crucify him yourselves." And the Jews answered, "We have a law, and by that law, he ought to be killed because he has claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard what he had said, he was afraid, and even he grabbed him and took him to the headquarters and asked Jesus, "Where have you come from?" But Jesus gave no answer. But he refused to speak, and Pilate said to him, "Why are you silent? Why don't you want to talk? Surely you know that I have the authority to release you, and I have the authority to put you to death or to crucify you," as most versions say. "You have no authority over me," Jesus replies to him. "If it had been granted you from above, and the deeper guilt lies with the man who has handed me over to you." So this is the type of dialogue that Jesus is having in John chapter 19 from verse 5 onwards. And from this moment on, it says in verse 12, Pilate tried to release Jesus. So Pilate is doing his utmost to release Jesus from the accusations and the insinuations that are being made by the people around him at that time. So Pilate tries as much as he can to release Jesus, but somehow he accepts the demands of the Jews. As John would describe, the high priest and the crowd are quite unstable, and so he does not want to cause a riot or a problem. He himself does not care. He does not care about the Jewish law, the Jewish Sharia. He doesn't care what blasphemy has been broken right at this point. He doesn't care. He was a pagan Roman himself, and he doesn't care whether somebody claims to be the Son of God or God himself. And he would not find that a capital offense. He would not find it a capital offense, since he had Jesus flogged in the hope that this would somehow appease and satisfy and pacify the people. That was enough for him. He went over the head of the chief priest and addressed the crowd directly in hope that it would help release Jesus. You see, he had no right to actually address the people. It was actually the chief priests who had the right to address the people directly. But he thought, well, if he goes and addresses the people directly, they would surely want to release Jesus. But as always in the Gospels, there are angels, miracles, and the like. All of these serve the Gospel writer himself when he does whatever he does when he writes these things. And even though 3 of the Gospels do not mention it, Matthew has another reason why Pilate and the superstitious Roman would not want to harm Jesus. And he has in his version, while Pilate was sitting in the court, a messenger came with a message from his wife. And this can be found in Matthew chapter 27. "Have nothing to do with this innocent man. I have much trouble on his account because I had a dream of him last night." His wife sends this message to Pilate saying. So this is the information that we get from this. It is unfortunate that due to later doctrinal problems, much of the literature, the scriptures, the rival churches' writings were destroyed on pain of death. So we actually don't know too much of what the other versions of the writers would have had about the same instance. So we only have the 4 Gospels writing their different versions, but even with these 4 Gospels, we see that they often write things in that the other 3 do not have. Now, some of the literature was, however, shall we say, miraculously saved. All the other literature was destroyed, all the other literature has been removed from planet Earth, but some literature miraculously, and I'm not saying that this literature has been leaked out like WikiLeaks, but somehow some of this literature has survived and gives some type of insight to what was actually going on during that time. And some of this literature that has survived, in fact it's just a small little letter, is a bit of apocryphal literature. And it is called the Letter of Herod and Pilate. Now, the Letter of Herod and Pilate, which is recorded in a Syriac manuscript, is now housed in the British Museum. And according to this, Tiberius Caesar was afflicted with a disease, and having heard of the miraculous healer, Jesus, was interested to do a miracle and cure him of his disease. But by the time Jesus was summoned, he had already been allegedly killed and crucified. And so you can imagine that Tiberius Caesar was not very happy. And so in this surviving miraculous document, it records the following. Now when the letter came to the city of the Romans and were read to Caesar, with no few standing there, they were all terrified, because they thought of the transgressions of Pilate, the darkness and the earthquake that had occurred in all the world. Pilate and his wife were brought to Rome and were tried for their wicked act. And when Pilate came to the place, he prayed in silence, saying, O Lord, destroy not me for the wickedness of the Hebrews. For I shall not have laid hands upon thee, but for the commotion and the lawlessness of the Jews, because they provoked sedition against me. But thou knowest that I did it in ignorance. Destroy not me for my sins, nor be mindful of the evil things that I did. O Lord, and in thy servant Procla, which is his wife, who standeth with me in this hour of death, whom thou hast taught to prophesy that thou would be nailed to the cross. This is found in the letter that miraculously survived. In this letter, it talks about how the people were aware of this earthquake and the great, tremendous phenomena that took place worldwide. Of course, there's no other document anywhere else that mentions all these things. But this miraculous document that is supposed to confirm the communication between the two. If you look at the Ethiopic calendar, on the 25th of June, there is a celebration that takes place annually of a saint. And the two saints that are celebrated on the 25th of June on the Ethiopic calendar, under it is inserted Pilate and his wife Procla. So Pilate and his wife Procla were actually turned into saints. The reason for making them become saints is that Pilate washed his hand of the whole incident and made himself innocent of Jesus' death, saying that he did not believe that Jesus was guilty. And Procla was also made into a saint because she tried to convince her husband not to have anything to do with Jesus' crucifixion. So both Pilate and Procla became martyrs and therefore became church saints. So the story of washing of the hands and not going through with all the rest of it was rewarded by the church by making them saints. But this is just one of perhaps hundreds of thousands of documents that circulated in the next 3 centuries, including the many various documents that were flourishing in that period of time. But these books, many of them were destroyed, many of them were not accepted, many of them are sitting even to this very day in universities and colleges in Palestine and Israel and other places of the world, and have not been released publicly. Some of them have been. But now let us go back to the Gospels, because we got sidetracked there. In John chapter 16 verse 2 it says, "But the Jews kept shouting, 'If you let this man go, you are not a friend of Caesar. Any man who claims to be a king is defying Caesar.'" Apparently, once the crowd shouted, this did the trick, and Pilate, who had been going in and out, sometimes talking to Jesus in his headquarters, sometimes bringing him out to where he was, sometimes taking him back for interrogation, sometimes going out to the crowd outside, because the crowd would not come into the courtyard in fear of religious defilement, now decided that it was time to take action. He could not dare to have taken action before, but when he suddenly realized that what the people said was going to cause trouble, then he was prepared to take action at this point. And it says, "And when Pilate heard that what they were saying, he took his seat on the tribunal at the place known as the Pavement." And this is a very important place of authority, like the seat of authority. And it was there at the evening of Passover. It was the evening of Passover when he did it. Some versions say it was Friday of the Passover about noontime. And Pilate said to the Jews, "Here is your king." And we'll continue from this point, inshallah, when we continue in the series. So from me, Areeb Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
All to the way of thy Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and argue with them in ways that are best and most gracious.
Allah has not asked us to make people Muslim.
Invite, offer, share.
Allah has asked us to invite people to Islam.
Be a part of the special mission for humankind.
Dawah is really an art. We need to refocus on the importance of dawah. And this is about time the ummah woke up.
In this unique workshop with Abdur Rahim Green.
We can't force anyone to be Muslim. What if we, as an ummah, could once again take up the duty and obligation of da'wah?
Learn how to aptly deliver Allah's message of Islam to people around the world in Dawah. Tonight at 10:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 6:30 a.m. Saudi Arabia on Peace TV.
Where truth is hidden, misleading quotations create confusion. Where truth is hidden, lack of knowledge and wisdom cause upheaval and commotion. Where truth is hidden, manipulated scriptures and twisted facts emerge. This very hidden truth creates false propaganda, mayhem, chaos, disorder, and turmoil in our lives and the world order. But is there anyone with courage and wisdom? What is the truth, and who has the courage to expose it? Because it's your right to know the truth.
Watch truth prevail and lies perish in Truth Exposed by Dr. Zakir Naik every Saturday to Thursday at 9 p.m. and repeat telecast at 7:30 a.m. Saudi Arabia on Peace TV. Peace TV English, the solution for humanity.